What's up, guys? Alexander here with Date Psychology. Today I want to talk to you about self-reports when we're looking at sexual behavior. How do we know when people tell you how many people they had sex with that they're actually telling you the truth? So, something to understand about psychology, about anything where you're dealing with people. Probably most of what you know is actually based on self-reports, right? So when you hear that 30% of men are single, that 60% of men are single, that 30% haven't had sex in the last year, all self-reports, right? When you read something like men that score high in the dark triad, they have more sex, they have more sexual partners. That's also a self-report measure, isn't it? That requires someone to report accurately the responses on the dark triad questionnaire that you use, and it requires them to report as well, honestly, how many sexual partners they've had, right? When you ask something like, who initiates most divorces, right? That's a common talking point. That's something that people discuss a lot in these spheres online. And they say women initiate most divorces. I think a lot of people think that this is based on divorce filings or something like that. No. This is based primarily on self-reports. By asking couples who initiated the divorce, who broke up with who, whose idea was it, right? If you look at actual divorce filings, for example, particularly in countries where they have mutual divorce, most divorces are filed mutually. And when you ask people, did you both agree on the divorce? Most people also report that both agreed upon the divorce. So statistics like this, who initiated most divorces? They rely on self-reports, right? Personality measures, right? Those rely on self-reports. Anytime you give someone a questionnaire and you expect them to be able to report what they're like, what do they like, what would they behave like in a given situation. Self-reports, right? They require some level of introspection that the person can report honestly elements about themselves in that sense. Attractiveness ratings, right? When we say, people who are more attractive have more sex. People who are more attractive benefit from the halo effect, right? You take a group of people and you ask others to report how attractive is this person. Also a form of self-report that's has different elements than some of the others, but still a self-report nonetheless, okay? And if you ask people as well, in that context, if you say, okay, how attractive is this person for a short-term sexual relationship, for a long-term relationship, for marriage, then it gets even more complicated. Then you're asking for self-reports on specific elements that may in turn affect those outcomes as well, right? So anytime that you're asking a person, what did you do? What did you say? What would you like? Or something about themselves. Are you happy or not? What's going on in someone's mind? These all rely on self-reports. And there are questions about how accurate those may be. How accurate they may be varies across measures, right? It depends on what specifically you are asking. Given that, there is one element of self-reports that is focused on often when it comes to sexual behavior, right? And that's social desirability bias, which describes a desire to report answers on a test that make you look better in a sense, right? That would be more socially desirable. Is someone reporting something because they think that's what the experimenter wants to hear, or because they think they would be punished for it, or because it is negative or something like that, right? So given that, something to consider is that a lot of research on social desirability bias is old. It comes from a period of time when you administered a survey, someone would have to come into the lab, maybe they would sit down in front of you and fill out a survey, and then you have someone looking at you, and that can affect social desirability bias, right? Now, a lot of these questionnaires are much more anonymous. They can be completely online, so that can reduce it. We'll get into that a little bit. Additionally, with social desirability bias, a lot of this has to do with taboos, and we're talking about number of sexual partners, and the idea culturally is that having fewer sexual partners is good, particularly for a woman. Might be good to have more for a man, so you can see a reporting up, and other sexual behaviors as well. So there's a question, to what extent is having a lot of sexual partners even still taboo in 2023, right? Things that might have been taboo decades ago may be much, much less so today, and in particular, are people who have many sexual partners is likely to view that as taboo, right? Are they going to say that they had little, given that they're someone who is willing to have a lot of sexual partners or be very promiscuous in the first place? Perhaps they have very permissive attitudes about it, and they do not actually view having a lot of partners as negative to begin with. So some things to consider going into that. A second limitation here to self-reports is inaccurate reporting, right? People might report honestly as well as they can, yet at the same time, they might not know the answer to the question accurately. If I ask you a question like, can you tell me how many calories you ate last month? Whatever estimate you give, unless you're a bodybuilder and you track your calories really well, is probably going to be way off. People are really bad at estimating things like that. If I asked, how many people did you have sex with last year? Probably in that case, you will be able to report it more accurately. It's probably going to be a smaller number. It might be 0, right? And it might be 1. For most people, it's going to fall somewhere in that range, right? Of 0 to 2. So anyway, it's a small number. You can report it accurately, assuming that you want to. There's another question about inaccuracy in reporting that is how a participant may interpret the question. So if I ask you, did you have sex last year? You might say, what does sex even mean, right? What does it even mean to have sex? Does a blowjob count? Does oral sex count? Does this and that count? So looking at this example here, this is from a recent YouGov survey just a week ago, maybe not even a week ago, maybe just a few days ago. About half of participants in the UK that responded to this survey said that they did not believe oral sex was sex. So if you just ask, are you going to have, or did you have sex, right? If half of the people believe that oral sex is not sex, you may get under-reporting in that case. Of course, the way to address this in your methodology would be to ask about specific sexual behaviors, which some does, some does not, right? You would say, did you have sex? This is how sex is defined. Or did you have penetrative sex? Did you have oral sex? And you can break it down by item and you can kind of get around that problem. So that's one way to address at least people not understanding your question or interpreting your question a little bit differently. So given that we have these limitations, and certainly at face value, these limitations seem very damning, you know. People might lie, they might not understand your question. So who knows? Are they just telling stories, so to speak? Perhaps. But the bread and butter, so to speak, of psychology, of these questions that use self-reports, right, is what they predict. And this is called predictive validity. Does variable X predict variable Y? Variable X being your number of sexual partners, your score on a personality test, whatever, and then variable Y being whatever you want it to predict. So that will be the question going forward that we will look into, because that's probably the best way that you're going to be able to tell if these sexual partner reports are generally accurate across all of the research. First, looking at divorce. One thing that people discuss often is that having more sexual partners is associated with a higher likelihood of divorce. People have talked about this in various contexts, like, oh, does it harm someone's ability to pair bond, a woman's ability to pair bond? And the direction doesn't have to be that it's causal, right? We're looking at an association. So there could be a third variable that says, okay, someone who can't form relationships, can't stay in a relationship, is going to have more partners over the lifetime. There you go. So that's one idea. In any case, what we do see is the association, right? Which is not what you would expect if self-reports were all over the place, so to speak. You would not see an association between variable X, the report of partners, and variable Y, divorce. But we see the direction or the relationship, and we see it in the direction kind of that you would expect, right? Fewer partners associated with a lower likelihood of divorce, right? Something to consider. Going on to the next element here, we can look at sexually transmitted diseases. I'm surprised that very few people have talked about sexually transmitted diseases in kind of these promiscuity discourses online or wherever they may be, because STDs are probably one of the better ways to predict the prevalence of promiscuity in a society without relying on self-reports. So here is a chart, and this gives you an estimate of how many people approximately you would be having sex with if you had sex with one person who had the same number. This is an important concept going forward because the risk of contracting an STD increases exponentially with the number of people that you have sex with. You're not just having sex with two people. In a sense, you're having sex with all of the people that they had sex with as well. The implication of this would be that STDs in a population should be extremely high, even at relatively small rates of promiscuity in the population. Do we see that? Not really. So this concept going forward now, here is a similar graphic, and this gives you an idea of the probability of contracting an STD. Now this is for gay men. Some of these probabilities are similar, some are going to be different. But this gives you an idea of the probability of contracting an STD if you have sex just one time, okay, with another person. Herpes, close to 5%. So given this, if you think of someone who is relatively promiscuous, right? They're having sex with multiple partners over multiple periods, right? Usually people have sex with the same person multiple times, even if it's a casual kind of relationship. So you have people having sex with many people, many times, over a period of time. The probability that they're going to contract an STD, it's actually really, really, really high. So why do we not see, for example, most people having STDs? What would you expect looking at this slide now? If the meme were true, right? If you say, okay, most women are promiscuous and most women are having sex with the top 10% of men. Meanwhile, the bottom 90% of men, even the bottom 50% of men, whatever the case may be, a small percentage of men are having sex, the top 10% of men are having a lot of sex, and women are being largely promiscuous with this top 10% of men. You would expect a distribution of sexually transmitted diseases where the top 10% of men, they have STDs, almost guaranteed. Anyone that's having a lot of sex with a lot of partners, very, very high chance. At the same time, you would expect most women, right, to have an STD. And you would expect that bottom portion of men to have very, very few STDs. So moving on now, what do we actually see? Here are rates of STDs, specifically gonorrhea, from recent data in 2019 for men and women. We see that rates are pretty similar, okay? In this case, we see that women have gonorrhea at a little bit higher rate within the 10 to 14, 15 to 19 age range, and then it kind of settles out at the little bit later age ranges between 20 and 24 and up. So something to consider about STDs is that transmissibility has sex differences. Women can contract them easier than the other way around due to biological differences in your equipment, so to speak. Symptoms manifest differently, so sometimes reporting can be a little bit different. In any case, the rates we see kind of similar. Here's another chart. This one is for syphilis, which is a disease that's going to manifest outwardly more visibly in men in many cases than gonorrhea. And what do we see? Kind of an opposite pattern where the ratios for men reporting this are actually much higher. So kind of a flip from gonorrhea. But in either case, it's not what you would expect to see if the top 10% of men were having all of the sex. Most women having sex promiscuously with this top 10% of men, and the rest of men are not having sex. Not the expected pattern in that case. Let's look at the same question again and add something to it. So what would you expect if very few men were having sex, the top 10% of men were having all the sex, a lot of sex with a lot of different people, and women were being very, very promiscuous with this top 10% of men? Keeping in mind from the first chart, okay, that it doesn't really matter if a woman just sleeps with that one man. If that one man has been very, 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 very promiscuous, that's going to raise the risk of transmission a lot. So what you would expect to see in this case is a trend over time where there is an increase in female reporting of sexually transmitted diseases, diagnoses, I should say, and a decrease in male. So what do we see from the same data? At the top line, this is men who have sex with men. So well known in the literature is that men who have sex with men, higher risk for most sexually transmitted diseases. This is for syphilis specifically. What do we see for men who have sex with women and women? The rates increase the same, okay? So we don't see, for example, a sudden spike in syphilis among women and a decline in men if there was a big sex discrepancy in who was having sex. This is a ratio that's much, much more consistent with a 1-to-1 ratio, basically that men and women are having sex at a very similar rate. How does this tie in to self-reports? So, in epidemiology, there's a term that is used, the promiscuous 10%. This is used to describe the observation that the top 10% of people that come in to get tested, right? The top 10% of people that are having sex out there, sexually active, that have a lot of partners. When I say top 10%, I mean the most promiscuous people. They report a disproportionate number of sexually transmitted diseases. It's not evenly distributed, okay? Sexual partner count, as people self-report, it predicts very accurately STDs diagnosed. If you are in this top 10%, your risk of STD contraction, diagnosis, whatever the case may be, is about 8 to 10 times higher. So we see a relationship between sexually transmitted diseases and reporting, self-reports, of partner count that demonstrates predictive validity. Self-reports predict what we expect them to predict. Next slide here. So this is the prevalence, or I should say, this is the number of sexual partners reported in 2021 for the age group 18 to 25. About 80% of men and women fell between 0 and 1. We're going to call these the bottom non-promiscuous individuals. They make up about 70 to 80% of the population. And we can include the people that had two partners within the past year in the top 10. So we're going to call this the 20 to 30% range here from the GSS statistics that I ran in 2021. Consider that this distribution mirrors very well the prevalence of diseases in the population, of sexually transmitted diseases in the population. Across all of them, generally you have about 30% of the population that has had something within the past year and the rest that has not. So again, we see a correspondence between people who report being promiscuous over the past year and the rates of sexually transmitted diseases in the past year. Another method that we can use to check for the validity of self-reports is called the bogus pipeline, okay? This is something that has been used for 50 years now. It's not used often, but it is something that you can kind of use to get an idea of where self-reporting may be high or low on a question. Because, as I said, self-report bias, inaccuracy, will depend on the question that you're asking. In the case here, we're going to focus on sexual partners. So the bogus pipeline, how does this work? So it uses a lie detector test, a polygraph. As many people know, a polygraph test, not accurate. People call it pseudoscience. Usually it's inadmissible in court. It will not tell you if someone has told the truth or a lie. It will tell you if someone is nervous, if they have a spike in their heart rate. If you shock them with electricity, that will register in these measures. So it does that. It measures physiological responses. It doesn't tell you if someone is lying or not, because people might just be nervous or whatever the case may be. But people don't know that. Most people don't know that. Maybe today, maybe more people know that, but certainly when much of this research was done, and some is recent as well, people did not know that. Most people, I will continue and say, probably don't know. And so this works that when you put someone in the lab and you hook them up and you tell them this will detect if you're lying, are they going to be more honest is the idea. You give them a test before. So how many sexual partners did you have? Then you wait a while, a day or so, you bring them back into the lab. You hook them up to the machine and you have them do it again. You say, this is going to tell if you're lying. Do they change their responses? Do they say, oh man, I said I had 0 sexual partners, but I've actually had sex with 100 people. Is that what we actually see in the results? Well, here's a meta-analysis of bogus pipeline research across all, well, it's a meta-analysis, I say across all of the research. This doesn't look just at sexual partners. This is generally the effect that you see in bogus pipeline conditions across the research. Cohen's d of negative 0.22. So what does that mean? That it does produce an effect. It works, okay? But the effect is very, very small across the literature. Here in this chart, you can visualize what an effect size of 0.22 looks like. You can see the before and the after, the control versus the treatment. It's very, very small. And this is what we see, again, when we begin to look at the specific question of sexual partners using bogus pipeline methodology. Alexander and Fisher conducted this in 2003. They found no effect on sexual partner reporting. Went back, did it a year later. They found a very, very small effect, significant, but as I say throughout these videos, statistical significance is not a measure of effect. You want to look at the actual effect size. How much did this bogus pipeline increase? Well, for people who had sex, and most people did not, okay, they reported maybe an increase of about 1 to 2 partners on average. So if people are exaggerating these self-reports or misreporting or whatever the case may be, it doesn't seem to be a huge jump from, oh, I said I had 1, but I actually had 100. This is something you'll see if you look at research across the literature on sexual behavior using the bogus pipeline. In the past slide, what did we see? Null. And then we saw an effect. And this is what happens across research, particularly given publication bias. The file drawer effect means that many studies that find a null effect don't get published. So when you start looking across the research and you start saying this one found an effect, this one didn't find an effect, this one found an effect, this one didn't. You look at the meta-analysis, very, very small effect size. You have to wonder, is this effect even real, even when you see a couple of studies that show it is? Here is a study by 2 researchers. I won't attempt to pronounce the name, I apologize. On sexual behavior, they asked about specific sexual behaviors before and after. In S, what does that mean? Not significant. So they found differences before and after. The differences were not so much that they could not be attributed to chance. They looked at sexual partner count in this before and after as well. Again, no statistically significant difference. And this is kind of what you see in bogus pipeline research. If it detects an effect of sexual partner increase in the bogus pipeline, it tends to be pretty small, but very often it doesn't. So what does that mean? There are 2 possibilities here, okay? People could be telling the truth, and that's why you don't see the increase. If someone says, I had sex with 2 partners, they're telling the truth. You hook them up to the machine. Are they going to change their response if they think that the machine is going to detect them being honest and they were honest? No. So when you see a non-significant difference, it's very, very possible that's because the bogus pipeline or because the question that you're asking related to sexual partners had an honest response in the control condition and in the follow-up condition, or between your 2 groups, assuming it wasn't a follow-up with the same individuals. A second question would be, of course, does it even work? You know, maybe people are lying in the first and they're lying in the second. They don't think that the machine is going to detect their lies, so they don't care. Or they think that it might anyway, and they're just like risking it, right? They're going to say, I lied, but I'm not going to change my answer now. How embarrassing would that be? So one way to know if this methodology works is to look at other questions. And it actually does seem to work pretty well when you ask questions that are actually very, very sensitive. Strang and Peterson, a recent study here, they asked men, would you be willing to engage in this kind of illegal sexual coercion, right? So basically the R word, right? Rape. Men, do you approve of this? Would you do this? When they were not under the lie detector test, no, they say no. You put them under that, they will report yes 6 times more frequently. And yet, in the same study, same participants, did they increase or decrease the number of sexual partners that they reported? No. So asking a question about sexual assault is certainly much more controversial, much more taboo. It has implications legally, right? If you say, I would do this, Is that something that can be used against you in the future if you are accused or something like that? Or maybe they did in the past, whatever the case may be. So that's a question that's very, very taboo, and it's illegal, okay? Right? They're reporting a behavior that is illegal. Having sex with a lot of people is not, Is it taboo? For some people, yes. For some people, no. But it's not a crime. What we see is that the research methodology works well when you ask questions appropriate for it that might actually have a large degree of social desirability bias. Why doesn't it work well for sexual partners? Maybe there's actually very, very low social desirability bias associated with having a lot of sexual partners in 2023. That is kind of my suspicion. So a note on that before we look at one of these next slides. There is another element of use in bogus pipeline conditions that may actually inflate desirability bias to begin with, and this was something I mentioned at the beginning of the video. Kind of the gold standard for sexual behavior research at this point is using an anonymous survey, right? You don't want to be in front of the person. If you sit someone down in front of you and you make them tell you, like, hey, how many people did you have sex with? Maybe they'll be embarrassed and they will say less. Similarly, if you take someone on a date, you meet someone on Tinder, you go on a first date, and you're asking them, how many people did you have sex with on the first date? They want their responses could be anywhere. So that is kind of the condition that we're looking at. You bring people into a lab, you put them on a machine, and you're testing them, okay? That's probably even going to inflate desirability bias more than just a simple questionnaire. And it's actually remarkable that we don't see a big change in that case, since we would expect more bias in the control or the pre-test than we would in the comparison group and the post-test, right? So again, is that compelling to you that people are pretty honest on their sexual partner count surveys? I find it pretty compelling, but you decide, leave a comment, let me know what you think about that. So slide here, what does all of this mean, this research? What can we gain from that going forward? For sexual partners, at least, not necessarily anything else on self-reports, because it's item by item, but for sexual partners, they're probably pretty good, right? They predict what we expect in outcomes that are not self-report measures. Divorce, sexual behavior. They predict who is going to get married earlier, who will get married in the long term, although some recent research has called that into question as well. And things that you would expect kind of stereotypically as a norm associated with low and high promiscuity, sexually transmitted diseases. Why has there been so much focus on self-report bias? Perhaps because a lot of old research, as I mentioned, was done in person. It's only relatively recently you could give someone, a survey online, or that you could recruit a completely anonymous sample off of Twitter or social media or ProQuest or MTurk or wherever you're getting your online sample from. You don't even see those people. They don't know who you are. You don't know who they are. So you have this wall of anonymity in between you and them that makes them more comfortable to report accurately. And then, of course, as mentioned, perhaps sex is just not that taboo anymore. And certainly for people that actually have a lot of partners, perhaps it's even less taboo for them. They don't care at all to tell you how many they have had. So how does this tie into the discourse, the general discourse floating out there in the world, in the manosphere, in dating discourse online? There are a lot of, legitimate concerns. The ones that we talked about at the beginning. How accurate are self-reports? At the same time, there is a lot of motivated reasoning to deny self-report findings. And certainly, I have seen many, many cases. People will say, you can't trust that, it's a self-report. And then a little bit later, they'll post a study that relies on self-reports, right? So people very, very selectively pick the results that they like, even though the bulk of anything regarding sexual behavior relies on self-report data. So promiscuity narratives, I've called these promiscuity narratives in the past. And what these are basically are narratives in popular culture, in what I call our folk psychology, what people believe about the behavior and psychology of others commonly, even if it is not a part of research psychology. People tend to believe that promiscuity is very, very high. I did not post the study, but it came to mind. There's research that indicates if you ask people's peer group, you take a friend, let me explain. You take a friend out of a peer group, boom. You ask his friends, how many people did she have sex with? How many people did he have sex with? They'll say a lot. They'll overestimate the promiscuity of their friend. The friend will report less. You take another person out of their peer group, they'll report less. So it's common that we overestimate the promiscuity of our friends, the people that we know, our peers, and also promiscuity in society in general. But when we look at actual measures of promiscuity, if it's, the STD as a proxy, if we look at things that it predicts, if we looked at self-reports, whatever the case may be, any measure out there, it actually indicates that real promiscuity, people having sex with a lot of partners, pretty rare. Again, relegated to that so-called promiscuous 10% of the population. Something to consider as well. I didn't put this in the slide. That promiscuous 10%. Assortative mating, guys. They are mostly hooking up with the other promiscuous 10%. So you don't have necessarily a lot of overlap between the people that report, I had 0 sexual partners, because they're not dating, they're not having sex, whatever the case may be. Someone that says, I had sex with 1 partner in the past year, who is probably someone that's in a relationship and has simply had sex with their partner throughout the course of the past year. Or even someone that says, I had 2, because that could just indicate I was in a relationship, I broke up, now I'm having sex with someone else, and we're kind of in a thing together. So really, you look at people that have had sex with, 3, 4, and up partners within the past year, and it makes up about that promiscuous 10% that you would expect to be represented disproportionately in the STD, STI infection statistics. There is also a trend related to this, very common in online discourse. People will say, I don't believe in self-reports. You can't trust what people say. So where do they form their beliefs about human behavior, about sexual behavior of other people? Very often, it's not from their own experience, especially if we're talking about subgroups within the manosphere, in these dating communities online, I should say, whatever the case may be, that are often individuals that are not actually sexually active themselves, or that may be struggling a lot. Where do they form opinions that promiscuity is very, very, very common? Typically online, right? On TikTok and something like that. So is this a self-report? These anecdotes, you could call them the lowest form of evidence, right? The lowest form of self-report. As I said on a show with my friend Rico, believing something you see on TikTok, guys, it's kind of like believing something that you see on the Jerry Springer show, if you're old enough to remember reality shows from the 90s, the early 2000s, okay? People say things on social media because they get paid to do it, They get clicks for saying controversial things. You have someone who goes on TikTok and they say, I've had sex with 100 people. And then someone takes that clip and they post it online and they say, this is female behavior. That's probably the least representative example of female behavior that you can find. TikTok, for example, what we're seeing now in recent research associated with personality disorders, mental illness, and I'm not going to say everyone that has a TikTok, is has something wrong with them in that case, but certainly people that are building TikToks to post very, very controversial things about their behavior, about their own sexual behavior and that sort of a thing. This is very calculated for a very, very specific audience. At the same time, many people are using social media, TikTok, in ways that are very pro-social to share very good information. So I'm not judging anyone in particular with a TikTok. But I am saying that you should not base beliefs on the anonymous anecdote that you read on a forum, the crazy person that you saw on TikTok talking about how she had sex with 100 people the last month, or whatever the case may be. And also the genre now that we're seeing that are kind of like talk shows on YouTube, kind of in conjunction with the manosphere, where you will have a host who is a man. He will get 2 or 3 women to come on the show, and I don't know where he found these women, but consistently he gets women who are not very smart. And he says, well, what do you think about this? And the woman says, I don't know. It doesn't seem fair, and this and that. And they go across with this, example of female behavior, selected, handpicked from somewhere, I have no idea, of women who are not the sharpest tools in the shed. People see that and they think, oh, women are like this. you know, as opposed to, I don't know, picking someone normal. But you would not have a good show, I guess, if you picked someone normal and had a normal conversation. You have to pick someone who's an imbecile, who's a complete moron, and bring them on the show. And then you can say something controversial and they will say something dumb, and then everyone loves it, you know, which is certainly much more spicy. It's much more salient. It's much more available. And cognitively, you know, in judgment and decision making, you have availability heuristic, salience heuristic. What do people form beliefs on? What do people form probability beliefs on? What do they think is common, right? They think things are common, more common than they are when they are salient, which means you see them a lot, they're striking, they are emotionally salient. Does it make you mad? Does it excite you? Is it something that makes you sad or cry? And something that you see often. So if you're watching TikTok all the time, you're getting bombarded with what the algorithm gives you, which is the spiciest takes, the most controversial takes, the worst examples of human behavior that you can find online, and that's all you see all day long. That's going to give you a very different picture of human behavior than if you take, you know, a nationally representative, anonymous sample of people who are normal from the general population. And so then you see, you know, self-report, you know, 10,000 people, anonymous sample, nationally representative, 80% of people, no sex, one partner in the last year. And you think, how could that be? I am nonstop bombarded with promiscuous people on TikTok telling me how they had sex with 1,000 people and how they deliberately gave their boyfriend or their girlfriend an STD or whatever the case may be. And you get these two very, very, very different pictures. One of those pictures is representative, okay? One of those is much better evidence than the other. And on that note, something to think about, guys. When you read self-reports, when you see people say, I don't believe self-reports, and then they give you an anecdote from TikTok, all good things to think about. Thank you for watching. Like the video, subscribe to the channel. I'll make another for you very soon.